So one of the more well-known pathogens are actually our viruses. So viruses are a microorganism, but they are non-living and non-cellular, which means they're not made up of cells and they're not a living thing. So they cannot reproduce on their own. To do that, they actually require a host. So they don't use energy, they don't need food. Again, they're not a living thing, so they don't need food, they don't produce waste, they actually don't need energy to survive. So they contain DNA and a protein coat. So it's essentially a bundle of DNA surrounded by a protein coat that's going to help keep their structure. And they are much smaller than bacteria. Much smaller than bacteria. So you're going to need a much more powerful microscope in order to see them. So again, viruses can't reproduce on their own. They can only reproduce in what's called a host cell. So they typically destroy their host in this process. So they have to use the host cell's machinery to reproduce. So essentially they'll take it over and use it for their own reproduction purposes. So where the cell would typically be reproducing and making its own energy, the virus is actually going to take a hold of that, it's going to commandeer it, it's going to take it over, and it is going to use that host cell's machinery in order to reproduce. So they can remain inactive for a cell for long periods of time before they begin to reproduce. That's how we often hear of a lot of carriers of viruses. So someone has the virus inside their cells, but the virus is not yet reproducing. And this can be long periods of time before we'll actually start to see that virus reproduce within a cell. So we are going to talk a little bit about the good of viruses. So environmentally, they do serve as an important form of population control. So it serves as a limiting factor. So it keeps certain populations of animals or plants from getting too high. So where if say a deer population were to overtake everything, all of a sudden all the grass is gone and it completely throws off the food chain. So viruses do actually serve as a very important limiting factor for population control of certain species. And as far as people, we're actually developing new ways to use viruses as a source of new medications. So this is a very new technology. It's not something that's been around for a long time, but we are beginning to use viruses and that reproduction method to actually produce new medications, which is pretty exciting. And finally, obviously there are some pathogenic viruses. So again, those disease-causing viruses. So some of the big ones are HIV, which again, that's human immunodeficiency virus, gives you a clue. Chickenpox is actually a virus, same with Ebola, which has been in the news a lot. Rabies, the flu is a virus, and so is the common cold. So when you hear those phrases, a lot of them that, you're just going to have to write it out, it's a virus. And the reason you're just going to have to write it out, like something like the flu or the common cold, is because they cannot be cured with any current medication that we have. But we can treat the symptoms. So like if you have the flu, you can take a sinus medication or a cough medication. We can treat a fever, but we can't actually cure them yet. So antivirals can control or prevent the spread of some of these viruses. So again, those antivirals are going to keep those viruses from spreading or can actually prevent their spreading at all, which is pretty impressive. And then many of our viruses can be prevented with vaccines. So the flu, again, when we talk about that flu shot, that's kind of a preventative vaccine that is supposed to ward off the flu virus.